of short provocations, big ideas from bold thinkers. And this is designed to help us think differently about what enables research to actually drive real world change. Not just ideas on paper, but action that makes a real difference in people's lives. We've invited three leaders to talk to us who work at the intersections of research, policy and practice and advocacy. Each of them brings a unique perspective and distinct from each other, and they remind us that evidence doesn't live in isolation. It's shaped by power, values and systems we work within. We'll hear from each speaker for around 5 to 7 minutes, and I'll prompt them gently if they go longer. And as Sue mentioned, at our May event, we heard that change doesn't just happen at the end of a research project. It starts right at the beginning with relationships, with collaboration and purpose. But we've also heard that sometimes this is not enough as well. Some strong research still struggles to get used, and policy windows shift and government priorities change. And advocacy organisations get very stretched as well. And so we'll hear first from Jane Spring. And so these short provocations, each speaker will bring a different lens from strategy, from research, from systems, from lived experience to challenge our thinking about what really enables research to make a difference. We'll hear from Natalie Wade and Minister McAllister after we've heard from Jane and Sally, who I'll introduce as we go. But first, it's my great delight to begin with Jane Spring and introduce Jane. Many of you all know Jane as the chair of Australia's the Advisory Council of Australia's Disability Strategy, and has spent decades being a change maker, working across education, disability and justice. And as the NDRP is a key initiative of the National Disability Strategy, it's really important that that the NDRP supports the goals of the strategy. So thank you so much, Jane, for reminding us of the power of alignment and the role research can play when it's connected to clear priorities and strong partnerships. So over to you, Jane.
Thanks very much, Mary. It's really a privilege to join everyone today. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a white older woman with shoulder-length hair. I've got red glasses, a blue jacket, and I'm a wheelchair user and have been for 35 years. I'm joining you from the lands of the Wongal people and pay respects to elders past and present and to all First Nations people in the session today. It's a real privilege to join everyone for this really important conversation. I come to this discussion with a lot of different hats. I'm chair of the Advisory Council for Australia's Disability Strategy. I'm chair of the Disability Council New South Wales. I'm a director of Institute of Public Administration in New South Wales. And I'm a person with lived experience of disability who spent decades navigating policy systems as a public servant and as an advocate. And I want to start with a really simple question, which is, if we know what works, why don't we always do it? That's at the heart of translating evidence into policy. And governments say they want evidence-based policy, but in practice, decisions are shaped by narrative, urgency, budget cycles, and yes, of course, politics. So what kind of research is actually going to cut through? Well, it's not necessarily the most rigorous or innovative, but it is the most relevant, timely, and relatable. It's research that actually speaks to the questions that policymakers are already asking, or better yet, helps them see a new question they didn't know that they needed to ask. And that's where Australia's disability strategy matters. As a framework grounded in rights and lived experience, and crucially, including commitments to outcomes, evidence and evaluation, it is prompting governments to ask, what difference are we making and how do we know? We now see work to embed the voices of people with disability in evaluating the strategy. We really need people with lived experience being engaged as co-designers, co-evaluators, and not just as participants. And this is going to be a real shift. It says inclusion isn't just a value, it's actually a method. But I want to ask, what would it take to flip the whole research cycle? What if people with disability weren't only included in evaluation, but in governing what gets researched in the first place? What if the research priorities were shaped by the things we want to know, that we're curious about, the barriers we want to see dismantled, the systems we want changed, and the evidence that we know we need? And that's why we really need people with disability in the leadership roles that set this framework and challenge on the boards and the governance bodies of research organisations. And I don't just mean as advisory members, I mean as the decision makers. And what about having people with research on all the funding panels, the steering groups and the ethic committees? I have another hat. I'm on the board of Royal Rehab, and I'm also on the Clinical Quality and Safeguards Committee, which oversees the research done by that organisation. And what I see in that role is that when people with disability are in that room, shaping the questions and setting the expectations, the research immediately becomes far more relevant, and its impact is much more real. Because when you include people with disability at the start, you don't just get more inclusion, you actually get better questions. You get research that's grounded in everyday experience and not just academic curiosity. You get findings that resonate and that people want to act on. As a director of the Institute of Public Administration in New South Wales, that's a network that looks after the 400,000 public servants in New South Wales in terms of education, learning, and networking opportunities. I can also see the incredible value and commitment in the public sector. Many public servants want to use research, but they're often navigating short timeframes, patchy access, political pressure, and competing priorities. So what would make it easier for those public servants to use evidence that has been fully informed by people with disabilities? How about some trusted relationships between the researchers and the policymakers? How about co-design of research question with shared ownership of data? How about plain language insights and not just journal articles? And how about leadership that values lived experience as a key form of expertise? So here's my provocation, and I like this idea of being provoking. I'm sure I often am provoking, but this is constructive provocation. What would it take to flip how research is prioritised, funded and governed so that it starts with the voices of those most affected? What would it take for inclusion to be the default and not the exception? And what kind of evidence would we be producing if people with disability were driving the questions from the very beginning? Thank you.
Mary speaking. Thank you very much, Jane. There's a lot in that provocation, and really thanks for your wisdom today. Our next speaker is